Niger and Nigeria. Now, this past Tuesday, Al-Shabaab militants attacked a base housing African Union peacekeepers southwest of Somalia's capital, Mogadishu, killing Burundian troops. So this gives a picture of the challenges faced by the continent, and the African Union has said it hopes to achieve Aspiration 4 of Agenda 2063, which aspires for a peaceful and secure Africa through the use of mechanisms that promote a dialogue-centered approach to conflict prevention and resolution. We're joined now in the studio by His Excellency Ambassador Bankole Adeoye, African Union Commissioner of Political Affairs, Peace and Security, to talk about the bid to silencing the guns and why he's here in South Africa. Very good evening to you, and thank you so much for joining us, Ambassador. Perhaps let's just start with your tour of, I know there are going to be several countries, but let's start with South Africa, where you are. Why it was important for you to be here?
No, thank you for having me. South Africa is a leading active member of the African Union, and I'm here to engage at the highest political level with the ministers responsible for international relations and cooperation, the Minister of Defense, and of course the opportunity to engage with the number of AU, African Union organs that you host in South Africa, particularly Pan-African Parliament, the African Peer Review Mechanism, African Union Development Agency, NEPAD, and of course the African Commission on Nuclear Energy.
And we'll talk about some of those organs, the policy suggestions that they're making, but perhaps let's just start with pretty much what is on our doorstep. We're talking about silencing the guns. It doesn't really seem to be panning out that way. The reasons behind that, we can discuss it in just a moment, but South Africa and the SADC region have had to send troops to Mozambique because of insurgency activity there. How concerned is the African Union about this?
Very, very concerning, for the fact that Southern African region used to be one of the most stable on our continent. But today, the persistence and the threat of terrorism, violent extremism, insurrection, insurgency have now engulfed our 5 regions, from north to east, south, west, everywhere. And this is why our leaders are committed, and we really want to salute the courage of the Southern African Development Community for coming together to deploy a standby force mission to Mozambique to support the fight, the combat against terrorists and violent extremists, driven by warped ideology of hate that is not in any way in our culture. And this speaks to the essence of working together as one.
Ambassador, I do apologize for just cutting you short. We have some breaking news coming through from the Eastern Cape, where the governing party is holding its elective Congress. We mentioned that there have been tensions that have even led to a court interdict. Samkele Maseko, our colleague, is there in East London. He was just speaking to us earlier on about the sources of some of these tensions. Samkele, what can you tell us about what's happening now? Union Commissioner of Political Affairs, Peace and Security, and you were just talking to us about the concerns of the African Union with regards to peace and security. So you were just saying part of the AU structures or organs are here in South Africa that you're going to consult. I want to talk about the African Peer Review Mechanism and some of its policy suggestions as a tool for conflict prevention. What have been some of the advice that they have pointed out? And I know they do, I think it's like an biannual report on some of the conflict situations. And I'd like to look at, let's take the Central African Republic, for instance. The AU was very much involved in the mediation efforts in 2019, but unfortunately that fell apart. what are you hoping to glean from further consultations with APRM on some of these issues? Like, for instance, how Mozambique could have been prevented, because some have said there have been warnings of jihadist groups, moving further south and in their bid to gain control, terrorizing communities.
No, definitely the menace of terrorism compels all AU organs, bodies to work for collective security, to deepen democracy and robustly respond to the challenges we have. And that is why we are engaging the APRM, which is our hub for political governance and democratic renewal. It is important that we work together, we invest more in conflict prevention, early warning, but as well as early action. And this could be done if all of us in the AU family, in the AU system, work together with our partners, work together with member states and the regional economic communities like SADC. And therefore, this is a collective effort, because we all have our different mandates, but these different mandates all speak about collective security, driven by the concept of African solutions to Africa's problems. It is important that we invest more in conflict prevention so that we can collectively, headlong, address the challenges we have on the continent.
I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, Ambassador, that perhaps the African Union should concentrate more on an overarching strategy, governance strategy, as opposed to what is being called the traffic jam of peacekeeping efforts, because it is seen to not quite work to the full extent that the African Union hopes. I mean, part of what you're here to do is to identify peace and security governance synergies on the continent. So what are you looking for here in a bid to achieve that?
The first is that there is now greater need, the imperative to bring the mainstreaming of political governance into peace and security in what we call the African governance architecture, speaking to synergies with the African peace and security architecture. These plans, these strategies exist already, but now is to re-energize the implementation and the devotion of our leaders, of our members of the society, of the relevant actors to work together, bringing women, youth, and all stakeholders to promote democracy, at the same time ensure that peace and security, as well as sustainable development in a nexus approach, appeal to all of us. The challenge is to bring this to the national level and the regional level, working at continental level. So our focus, since I took office about a year ago, is basically to invest in that renewal, work with all the stakeholders, and bring lasting peace based on Agenda 2063, which is the Africa we want in the long term.
I mean, Africa is often criticized as having older autocratic leaders and suffering those strongman politics. The African Union sometimes, accused of not acting quickly enough. If we look at what has happened in the Sahel region over the past 3 years and the illegal takeover of power, it has been the view by some that the military, for some reason, believe that they ought to be seen as equal partners of democratically elected governments. What are your thoughts on that? And we'll look at what has happened in Equatorial Guinea. We'll look at what has happened in other parts, Mali, for instance, where the military believes that it is not satisfied in the manner in which a democratic elected government steers the ship, that they perhaps ought to have equal say in how the country is run. And some see that as very problematic.
Africa is a transforming continent, politically and in all ramifications. At the same time, the African Union leaders have repeatedly expressed zero tolerance on unconstitutional changes of government. Legitimate concerns of the citizens must continually be addressed, but through the constitutional means and the rule of law. And this is what the African Union stands for since its establishment, knowing fully well that the African Union Constitutive Act establishes democracy, political governance as the essence of the new Africa. The African renewal must be built on the commitment of the citizens to democracy, to the rule of law, to constitutionalism, and that is why in the next few days in Malabo, African leaders will gather again at a special summit, extraordinary summit, to address the scourge of terrorism and unconstitutional changes.
And part of that has been caused. In fact, I remember, I think it was a good 20 years ago when it was predicted then that in 20 years' time, most of Africa's wars will be due to, a battle of resources, and particularly water. Climatic changes we've seen have spurred a lot of conflicts, and I want to know, is there an approach that looks at these, what we're seeing in Egypt and Ethiopia, for instance, over the mega grand Ethiopian Renaissance dam, the resources of the Nile, that has created tensions even among the 10 countries that surround it. But the conflict in Ethiopia as well cannot be ruled out as part, even though it's a battle for power, governance structures. We can't ignore the fact that climatic changes are also spurring this on. I just want to understand, is there a strategy, as we mentioned, that overarching strategy that takes these things into account?
Absolutely. The African Union is investing in the nexus approach, peace, security, and the impact of climate change. We look forward to the next Conference of Parties, the COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, hosted by Egypt, as an opportunity to rally support for the African interest when it comes to climate security. All conflicts on the continent have been addressed through the right channel, particularly the Peace and Security Council and the Assembly. And this is why, in all cases, all conflicts, the African Union continues to preach and focus on peaceful resolution of all conflicts.
And we've seen quite a lot of this emerging or characterized by the conflict between nomadic tribes and herders. Some might say that is a sovereign issue, but because of that battle for scarce resources, which is water and food security, do you not have fears that this will continue to grow?
As you know, Africa is a victim of climate change and not much of a contributor to the climate variability that we're witnessing. Therefore, we have been in the forefront as Africa on the twin approach of adaptation and mitigation. This is what eventually investment in affordable energy in the long term that can help reduce the impact of climate change on the citizenry, as we have just witnessed, regrettably, in KZN, where you had a flood. These are effects of climate change, and of course can become a source of conflicts. And that is why all issues surrounding climate security are being addressed squarely by our leaders, also through the Committee of African Heads of State that exists. So
the dream, so to speak, of silencing the guns by 2030, it seems farther and farther away. You are preparing for the extraordinary summit on terrorism and unconstitutional changes for government in Malabo and Equatorial Guinea. I mean, we have seen what has happened where the African Union has thought its diplomatic efforts has helped them oversee transitional governments. That doesn't quite pan out to be the situation in the Sudan and also in South Sudan, or either it takes too long. And there is also, we mentioned earlier on, the attacks in Somalia. Those who are of the view that international funding is also what is constraining you, given the fact that Africa has been contending with COVID-19 and how that has constricted our resources generally. How do you intend to deal with that issue? While at the same time, we don't want to be at the behest of Western funders or directed by their funding, but at the same time, your peacekeeping efforts are facing challenges because of that.
Absolutely. But our leaders are beginning to invest more in financing peace support operations. And that is why the African leaders have re-established the African Union Peace Fund and renewed the call on the United Nations and the UN Security Council to support Africa's desire for access to the assessed contributions for peace operations. This is the only way that financing counterterrorism operations can be sustainable, predictable, adequate, and timely. And these are some of the steps being taken by member states. You mentioned the AMISOM transformation to ATMIS. ATMIS stands for the African Union Transition Mission in Somalia, where we hope that the investment, the legacy of AMISOM after 15 years will be worthwhile with this new peace mission that is centered on agility, mobility, and the right equipment, so that the sacrifices of African soldiers will pay off with the gradual transfer of security responsibilities from the African Union peace support operations to Somali security forces.
Well, Ambassador, when you come back, we'll get you on the line to talk about the Democratic Republic of Congo or the Great Lakes region. I think that in itself deserves its own conversation. But thank you so much for taking the time to join us here in studio. All the best for your 3-day visit here to South Africa. Ambassador, His Excellency Bankole Adeoye, African Union Commissioner of Political Affairs, Peace and Security, just speaking to us about his visit here in South Africa.